Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Hytale Together. Today I have some very important news to share with you, my fellow waiting room enthusiasts. Did you know that Hytale is actually a game? If you don't believe me, that's perfectly fine, because I don't believe me either. But what if I told you that Hytale is in fact multiple games? All the way back in... hold on. Man, really? It was that long ago. Anyways, the year is 2018, and Hypixel releases a pretty good trailer for a pretty cool looking game. And everyone who saw that trailer decided to wait for the game because it looked really fun, and it couldn't possibly take that long to come out. But that game is now gone, deceased, crumpled into a tiny ball and tossed into a garbage can, and lit on fire. That doesn't make any sense, you might be thinking. The game is still in development and is gonna release sometime this century. How could the game be gone? Because, my disembodied viewer, the game has changed. Hytale has changed. It will release eventually, but it won't be this Hytale. What does any of that mean? Basically, the game has evolved so much that by the time it comes out, it will likely be a completely different game. Why is this important? It isn't. But that's not the point. Today, I will convince you that Hytale 2023 is an absolutely, provably different game than Hytale 2018, and you can't stop me. First, I need to clarify that what they showed us in the 2018 trailer was indeed a functional game. Regardless of their current launch plans, Hytale was originally set to launch a little earlier than what we currently know. Now, obviously, a trailer is just that, the best parts, or more accurately, the prettiest parts of the game that they can possibly show. Which means that just because the trailer looks really good doesn't mean the game itself is particularly finished. However, again, this was made when their scope was relatively fair and their ideas for release weren't that far away. Meaning that Hytale from the 2018 trailer was fairly close to what they considered playable at the time. This is important because it means that whatever the game was back then, it was indisputably a semi-functional game, rather than just being a completely unfinished project. Alright, Hytale 2018 is a game, but how can I prove that it's actually a different game than Hytale 2023? Firstly, on a pure technical level, the game states probably aren't even comparable. On one hand, this can be attributed to the fact that by release they will have nearly 5 years of development since 2018, and those 5 years have been with new developers, a different scope, and different development practices. But beyond that, we know that they're now developing the game to be on multiple platforms, and they've specifically mentioned that this requires sizable changes to the engine itself. That is probably one of the deepest and most fundamental changes you can make to a game. And considering that they're doing this for the platform compatibility, these won't be small changes. Especially considering that they even said that this would be a rather time-consuming task. So these two versions of Hytale, on the most technical level possible, aren't the same game. But that alone might not be able to convince you. After all, take a look at Minecraft for example. It's a game that's on multiple platforms, and despite those versions having minor differences, at the end of the day, people don't really think of them as entirely different games, right? What would make Hytale any different? You know what? Fair enough. I suppose the underlying tech part of the game doesn't really affect the player. But you know what does affect the player? Gameplay. Probably. And you can bet that the gameplay itself has changed very much since the game's initial debut. First off, combat. Funnily enough, we've never actually been clued into what the main gameplay loop is exactly about, but there's a good chance that whatever you're trying to do is probably going to require a little bit of light persuasion somewhere along the line. So, what's actually changed that we know about? Well, for both PvE and PvP, pretty much everything. On the PvE side of things, the enemies have gone from using the absolutely groundbreaking, insane technique known as standing and hitting, to genuinely fighting and being able to give players a run for their money. Now, I'm sure not every dollar store skeleton is gonna have premium hands to be thrown, but that goes both ways. Now this is a very big difference, because the difference between fighting a basic and a skilled NPC pretty much entirely shifts how the encounters have to be played. In the former, fights end up being entirely about immediate positioning and a little bit of stat check, rather than any immediate skill. Then you have the absolute rabbit hole that would be a massive encounter with actually competent enemies. Exhibit A standing for actually, this is the only exhibit. You're in a room full of skeletons. Now, imagine for a second they all play like this. You are probably, definitely, in for a bad time. And that's just a basic encounter. This doesn't include bandits, soldiers, scarier monsters, or even bosses. And you can't even argue that this is just blanket better PvE in terms of development because it's entirely different in how you play it. And that's just PvE. I haven't even started on the player violence yet. Obviously, combat being different extends to both, but the difference in how it's played is pretty significant. The only real old PvP that exists to my knowledge is the very tiny clip that's featured in the 2018 trailer. You can't really see much, but what you can see is a lot different than what we've got now. Firstly, new combat has abilities. These are pretty important for reasons that should be obvious, but what isn't obvious is they add the dynamic of cooldowns to a fight, which does make a pretty big difference. I'm sure that makes sense because the difference between a guy who can power slam you into the afterlife and the guy who can't do that for another 5 seconds is pretty astounding. And this is not to mention things that they've talked about like stamina, charging up moves, and whatever else they decide to add in before release. Yeah, all of that seems to be a little bit more removed from whatever's going on here. Now, I've gone into combat specifically because it's the best example I could possibly give, but keep in mind that this is far from the only thing that's gonna get changed. The Hypixel team have at multiple points talked about combing through the entire game and analyzing it from the ground up. This has probably led to changes to the game's features, both core and otherwise, that far exceed what we even knew about the game in the first place. Think about it, the game is changing in ways we don't even know are possible. So if the game has entirely reworked mechanics, vastly altered technical systems, and has been doing these things for nearly the same amount of time the project was in development pre-reveal, can you really call 2018 Hytale the same game as the one they're gonna release? No, I don't think so. Remember earlier when I asked what was the point of asking about such a thing? I said there wasn't, but that's not entirely true. Because it does raise a very interesting question. Is Hytale 2023, or whenever they actually release it, going to be a better game than 2018's version? I mean, come on, that one's obvious, right? It has to be 2023 because all of this work they're putting in and everything, right? Well, who's to say? Sure, the developer team has expanded in both size and skill, but who's to say that the new path they set for themselves is better than the ones they originally were on? Or, here's another thought, what if the game released in 2020? Do you think that the eventual release we're gonna get would be better than the game with 3 years of public testing, player feedback, and general updates? Honestly, it's impossible to say, because for better or for worse, we've never really known much about the core game of Hytale, just disconnected bits and pieces that are probably outdated by now. But I do think it's interesting that such a question can even be raised, because we have the option of asking it, but the devs had to, and they apparently found an answer. Thank you for diving into my very helpful and extremely fruitful Hytale hypothetical. Wait a minute. Hytale? Hypothetical. Hypothetical. Whoa. Anyways, how different do you think 2018 and 2023 Hytale will end up being? Also, do you think they even made the right choice when they decided to push it back? Make sure you let us know in the comments, and thank you for watching Hytale Together. We'll see you next time.